If we ignore my dirty desk for a minute, I just want to say, you guys aren't going to believe what I got. It's a box, but more important than the box, there is something in the box, i.e. some markers. So, I'd like to take you guys all along with me as I try these out, see what they're all about. Didn't mean to rhyme. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Hope you're doing well. It's kind of funny that I'm making this video because I planned on doing another marker review video, but then the kind people who make these markers were very lovely and wanted to send me some to try out. So that was super cool of them. I want to make it clear this video isn't sponsored. All of the opinions that I have in this video are completely my own. But that said, they did send these to me completely free of charge, and I'm very grateful for it. It's the Sanjoki, I think that's how you say it. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Color the Life Professional Art Markers. I don't know what this says, but there is a brush nib and a chisel nib, which really stood out to me because most cheaper alternative art markers don't have a brush nib. I don't know if there's something about them that's just more expensive to produce. Most affordable alternatives to COPIC markers don't have a brush nib. You know, I think the only one that I've really seen that are like considered cheap alcohol markers are Ohu's. So I'm excited to try these out. There you go. And then a lovely picture, but enough staring at the box. Let's actually open it. This is the 80 set of markers. I believe they have other sets, but they sent me the 81. This I'm really excited about. When I was looking at their products online before I got this, I noticed the very cool case. Look at that. That's so nice. I love this. I didn't open it, as you can see. Piece of Velcro. I guess we'll find out what that's for, huh? Should probably start by taking this off. It'd be easier if I didn't have a band-aid on my finger. I've been itching to open this, so I'm so happy. I finally can! Wowza! Assuming this is the chisel end. Yep. I was going to say, because it, like, when markers have, like, a gray ring, that's usually where the brush or bullet nib is, but then I noticed that there's pictures, so that little hot tip was gonna be pointless, but let me just tinker with this for a second. Whoa! Oh! A strap. I'm assuming you hook it onto the loopies here. You can take it wherever you go. I don't leave the house much. Hello. I guess these are like issues that people have run into and how they will work on resolving those issues. Oh! And a swatch thing. And I guess I also get paper. This is a pleasant surprise. I'll probably test out this paper. I have no idea if I'm gonna end up making my finished illustration for this video on this paper, but we will see how it goes. Did I just hit the microphone? I am so sorry. Oh, they also have these. Oh, neat. When I was looking at these markers online, I saw someone do this with the case. This is a really cool case, I'm not gonna lie. I don't know if they sell just the cases, but if they did, I would definitely buy them and probably put my other markers in there. There's a couple of things I wanted to try out before I make a finished illustration. I'll probably swatch this in a time lapse, because this is a lot for me to just do. I busted out my sketchbook, but I guess I'll just test everything on this paper. I guess first I'll try just putting some flat colors down, and then I want to try blending different types of colors. Ooh. Already I really like the quality of these brush nibs. I'm pretty picky with my brush nibs. I don't like things that are too soft because then it's hard to control, but then if they're too firm, you can't really do much with them. Oh. This paper isn't exactly bleed proof. The actual markers go on nice, just probably put something here if you're gonna be using this paper. I'm gonna try out some feather blending, and if you don't know what feather blending is, flick it like that, and then with another marker on the other side, do the same thing. Whoa, look at that blending. I don't know if it's just the paper, but they do seem to be going on darker than the actual marker is. So once the ink settles, it gets a little bit lighter. That's me blending two pinks. I want to try blending two colors that are kind of opposite. It's easier to blend colors like this together, or it's like a lighter one and a darker one, but they're both pink. So let me try this yellow. This is a big reason why a lot of artists like me like brush nibs, because feather blending is perfect for many things of art. And feather blending is something I do a lot in my art. If you have just like a chisel nib or a brush nib, you can still do blending, and you can sort of like mimic feather blending a tiny bit, but it's definitely a lot harder. So being able to have that feather blend, it just makes life a lot easier. And then you might have saw me like layering more marker on top. That's just to like help even it out a little bit. I blended these opposite tones fairly well. It's not perfect, but that's kind of to be expected. Most markers don't blend like complete opposite tones super easily. Let me try with like a transition shade. What would be a good transition shade? Oh, I already made a mess of these. Of course I did, because this is what else would I be doing? Keeping things nice and clean and tidy. Don't know her. If you blend like two opposite colors, it's usually better to have like a transition shade. As you can see, it makes things go a lot smoother. I'm also curious to see how some of the lighter colors are, because I know another issue with a lot of cheap alternatives is that it's harder to get lighter colors. Oh my goodness, look at that. It's super pale. Let me test how white gel pen goes on top. Guess I'll let those sit for a minute. I also wanted to try a few different liners and see how the markers go with that. And I also wanted to see how they work with like colorized pencils. Alright, I'll let that ink sit for a minute. Let me just sketch something out really quick. I have no idea what I'm gonna make for a finished illustration. I'll probably decide after I swatch the colors. It's probably gonna be one of my characters, let's be honest. I totally didn't just mess up there. We don't gotta talk about that. The actual ink goes down super smooth too. Again, I don't know if it's just the paper because this is kind of paper made for these markers. So I'll probably end up doing my finished illustration on a different sheet of paper just to see how it works on different types, but this actual paper is pretty nice. So even if you just use the paper that it comes with, it seems to handle it really nicely. I mean, other than the bleed through, which is pretty common for most markers. This is the quintessential test right here. You don't want your markers messing with your line work, and these don't seem to. One thing that I want to try out before I switch over to time-lapse mode, I wanted to test out how they feel on different papers. This paper is pretty nice. It's thicker. Typically, I like my paper to be a little bit thicker. Some marker paper is extremely thin, and I cannot handle it. Looking at you, Canson. But this is pretty nice. I really like how they give you this, so then that way, as soon as you get the markers, it's just, you're ready to go. But two things I wanted to try out. My sketchbook. This is mixed media paper. Most of the sketchbooks I use are mixed media paper. And then some cardstock, which is one of the most common papers that I'll use for a finished illustration. Sometimes with paper like mixed media, where it's a little bit more textured, the alcohol really makes the texture obvious. So I want to see how these look. So far, it seems pretty good. This paper doesn't seem to like bleed onto the page underneath. Pretty much every single alcohol markers you use will always show on this page. I usually focus on whether or not it bleeds on here, and with these, it seems to depend on the type of paper, which is really common for a lot of markers. In my mixed media paper, it goes down really well. There's like a tiny bit of feathering, but I think that's more of the fact that these markers are new and like super juicy. The juicier a marker is, and like the more ink that's in it, the more likely it is to feather. And then the cardstock, there's like no feathering, so very nice, very nice. I'm very impressed with these markers so far. First impressions, pretty blown away, to be honest. I've tried a lot of markers in my past. I've tried a lot of really nice cheap alternative markers, and then I've tried some very not nice, pretty crap alternative alcohol markers. And these have got to be some of the nicer ones that I've tried so far. Of course, that's just my first impressions, so we will see how I feel after a finished illustration. I'll switch into time-lapse mode. I will swatch out all of the colors because I only played with like 3 or 4 of them, and then we'll see how they work in a finished illustration. I feel like the first most natural thing to talk about when you talk about a set of markers is the color variety. Generally speaking, I'm really happy with the variety that this 80 set of markers gave me. For my personal art style, if I were buying these myself, I would probably go for the 120 pack, just because I do use a lot of different tones of markers, and the way that I shade is fairly intricate, I guess you could say. Whenever I color with alcohol markers, I usually have a base color, I'll have a highlight color, I'll have 2 separate shading colors, and then I will have another color, like a red or a purple or something, that I'll put in the shading of all of the colors that I use. That being said, I felt a little bit restricted by the set of 80 colors, but if you have a more simple shading style than I do, then the 80 set is probably all you'll really need. I mean, even given the way that I shade and add highlights to my drawing, I was still able to make the set of 80 work. So I feel like that's a little bit more of a nitpicky thing than anything. The actual color variety itself, I was pretty impressed with, especially with the lighter tones. With a lot of cheap alternatives to Copic markers, you don't typically get those super light tones. I don't know if there's something about them that's more expensive to produce, or if it's like more difficult to produce or something like that, but a lot of cheaper markers don't have super light colors. But there's some really light colors that I was not expecting to get out of this set, and I was really impressed by it. In the actual drawing that I made in this video, I didn't use the chisel nib at all, I don't think. But to be honest, I feel like most artists don't use the chisel nib. Whenever they do, it's more for just like a big flat solid block of color rather than like an actual detailed thing within the drawing. But in terms of the brush nib, I was super satisfied with how it performed. Like I said earlier, you don't want a brush nib that is too flexible because then it becomes much more difficult to control. But you also don't want a brush nib that is too firm because then you can't get any flexibility out of it. And the big perks of having a brush nib is that you can go from super wide strokes to a really, really thin stroke. So then that way you can go between coloring larger areas and coloring smaller areas very, very easily. That and using a feather blending technique, which is essential in my art style. With the way that I shade, I use a lot of blending, and in order to do feather blending nicely, a brush nib is an absolute must. And in my personal opinion, feather blending is the most efficient way to blend your alcohol markers, and these brush nibs really came through when it came to the feather blending. You might notice me coloring outside the lines here and there. That's not necessarily because of the brush nibs, that's just because me. Returning viewers to my channel already know that, but I just wanted to make that clear. I colored outside the lines a regular amount for me, and not anymore, so I guess that shows that that isn't an issue with the nibs. One of the other things that I noticed pretty much immediately after using them is that the plastic on the barrels feels a lot more hard and cheap, and as a result, they hurt my hand just a little bit more. It wasn't to the point where I couldn't use them, which sounds like a downside, and I guess technically speaking it is a downside, but at least in my personal opinion, that's actually what you want with cheaper markers. Obviously, when you're making a cheaper alcohol-based marker, you're working on a budget. It's not like Copics where the markers themselves are going to be really expensive, so you can make everything about the marker like the highest quality ever, but when you're making a cheaper version, you need the markers to be more affordable. And the fact that the barrels themselves feel like they're made out of cheaper plastic means that they are putting a lot more time and money and effort into things like nib quality and ink quality. When you are making a cheaper product, you do have to make sacrifices like that to make sure that the product performs as best as it can. And I think these markers are an incredible example of that. While the barrels themselves feel like they're made out of cheaper plastic, the nibs and the ink performed wonderfully. And speaking of the ink, I was also really impressed with the quality of it. I'm gonna compare them to Ohuhu markers for a minute because those are seen as like the quintessential cheap Copic alternatives. I would say that the ink quality between these Sanjoki markers and the Ohuhu markers are about the same, honestly. One thing that I noticed about these markers is that the ink takes just a little bit longer to settle into the paper completely, and that in itself isn't a good or a bad thing, really it just depends on your own personal preference. When alcohol markers take longer to settle into the paper, it makes it a lot easier to create those smooth, flat layers that a lot of artists are looking for. But also that said, it does take a little bit more waiting time because you have to make sure that the ink is completely settled in before you layer any more markers on top of it. But again, if you have an art style that doesn't really require a lot of layering, that won't be an issue for you at all. And it wasn't really an issue for me either. I just had to wait a little bit longer and be a little bit more patient than I typically would be. And while we're on the topic of talking about the ink, I will say be a little careful of what type of paper you're using. I'm assuming this has to do with the ink quality. I can't think of what other issue it would be, but I didn't show in this video that I used these markers a little bit in a finished illustration in my sketchbook, and in my sketchbook it feathered quite a bit. If you don't know what feathering is, it's when you make a mark on the paper and instead of the color staying in that confined area on the paper, it sort of like bleeds out and makes this sort of feathering effect. It did that in my sketchbook quite a lot, but it didn't happen a single time when I was working on this drawing in this video. It might be a texture thing. I think the ink quality might not take well to textured paper like in my sketchbook, but the paper that I used in this video is really smooth cardstock. So if you are going to be using these markers, I would recommend going for a smoother paper, which typically is my own preference anyways. And whenever I do use alcohol markers, I go for smooth paper, but for my sketchbooks, I prefer a mixed media paper. So if you are using something like that, just be a little cautious. You could get a little around the feathering issue by not layering your ink as much, but just thought I'd let you know so you can keep it in mind. The only issue I had while I was making the drawing in this video is that I found the black marker bleeds just a little bit. You'll probably notice it in this video. I used the black marker in her hair and on her bathing suit, and whenever I would color the areas around it, I would accidentally brush brush up against the areas where I used the black marker and it would bleed. I don't know what about the black marker makes it so different to where it does bleed. I don't know if that's just my marker or if it's how all black markers of this brand work, but it's the only marker that did that. To be honest, I don't use black a whole lot in my art anyways, so I can't imagine this being an issue for me really at all in the future. It was just an issue that I had that I thought I would bring up. The last things I want to mention are two big pros to these markers that I couldn't really find a place to fit anywhere else. One of which is that there wasn't any real strong scent coming from these markers. Of course, with all alcohol markers, there is going to be some alcohol stench to it, and the closer you work to your paper, the stronger the smell will be. So if you're like me and like to work with your face an inch off of the paper, you tend to just get used to the smell of alcohol. But I've used a lot of markers and I've used a lot of cheap alternative alcohol markers, and something I noticed with the cheaper brands is that there is that really strong scent of alcohol. And in fact, there are some markers that I've used where the scent was so strong I had to stop using them and walk away for a minute because I just couldn't handle the fumes. But these markers, I didn't really smell them at all. The only time I did get that alcohol smell is, like I said, when I would put my head closer to the paper, which when I'm filming a video I try not to do anyway, so needless to say, scent wasn't an issue at all. And another thing that I wanted to mention, which might be a bit more of a personal preference, but it's something that I was really excited about, so I wanted to share it anyways. There wasn't a colorless blender in this set. I don't really like when sets of markers come with a colorless blender. A lot of people who don't know a lot about alcohol markers will see a colorless blender and think that it's essential. But I started using alcohol markers when I was 16 and I'm 21 now. In all those years of me using alcohol markers, I can count the times that I've used a colorless blender on one hand and still probably have fingers left over. It is not essential at all, and I always thought that it was just a waste to have a spot of markers taken up by a colorless blender. So normally when it would be like an 80 set of markers, it would be 79 colors and then a colorless blender. And even if it is just a single marker, I was always like, but there could have been a color there. But there wasn't that, and I was really, really excited about it. Before I give my closing thoughts on these markers, I did want to talk about the price a little bit. And again, for this part, I am going to be comparing them to Ohuhu markers. More specifically, the brush nib markers, because these markers are brush nib. There are some price differences between Ohuhu brush markers and Ohuhu bullet nibs. I am not talking about the bullet nibs. I am going to be focusing specifically on the price of the Ohuhu brush markers. With the Sanjoki alcohol markers, the 80 set of markers, at the time of me recording this video, they are on sale for a few dollars cheaper, but their original price is $31.90. All these prices are going to be in American dollars, by the way. And that averages out to about 40 cents a marker. And the larger 120 set of markers is $42.90, which you save just a tiny bit of money if you were to buy that one, because each marker averages out to about 38 cents. 2 cents would a steal, right? But if you're me, 2 cents is like, oh sweet, 2 cents, I saved 2 cents. For the Ohuhu brush markers, they don't have a set of 80. The closest that they have is a set of 72, and that set of 72 markers is $59.99, and the set of 120 Ohuhu brush markers is $99.99. Both sets come to each marker being about 83 cents. With the Sanjoki alcohol markers, for the 80 set, you get 8 markers extra for cheaper, and then with the Sanjoki 120 set of markers, you get the same amount of markers for more than 50% markdown, I guess. The markers aren't exactly the same. Like I mentioned, depending on what type of paper you use the Sanjoki markers on, you may or may not experience some feathering. My microphone cut out for a second. And that's not something that I've experienced a whole lot with other alcohol markers. Obviously, all supplies take to different types of paper differently, and each brand of each supplies will take to different papers differently. But generally speaking, with alcohol markers that I've used before, for the most part, they perform similarly on a variety of papers. There's just some basic rules of what papers to use and what papers not to use with a specific supply. And with these markers, it's not that you can't use them on a variety of paper, it's just that the way that you go about using them has to change a little bit. But if the main thing that you're looking for with alcohol markers is saving money, that is not a big sacrifice to make for the price of these markers. Comparing their price to how they performed both in my sketchbook and the art that I made in this video, I would say that it's absolutely worth it. I can absolutely recommend these markers, and I can say with 100% certainty that I am going to be continuing using them in the future. Continuing using them. I'm gonna continue using them. Poor grammar aside, I think you get my point. But anyway, let's head back to real-time Oliver and give my final thoughts. It's been a few days, so I've had some time to really sit on these markers, think about my experience, and I can say with certainty, I really like them. Overall verdict, absolutely can recommend. And I'm gonna be honest, people always say Ohu markers are like the best top tier, that was a little aggressive, the best top tier cheap marker alternative, COPIC alternative, however you would like to say it. But I'm gonna be honest, I think these might give Ohu markers a little run for their money. Granted, I haven't tried the Ohu brush markers, so I don't know how they compare directly to the brush markers, but you get more markers for a cheaper price. The brush nibs are honestly really great, especially for cheap marker alternatives. If you compare it to Ohu markers, the ink quality is about the same, and really when it comes down to it, it's more of just a personal preference thing on which you would prefer, and I would highly recommend giving these a shot, especially if you're new to alcohol markers and you don't really know where to start, and if you don't know if alcohol markers are really for you. I would really recommend trying these out. I think these are a wonderful place to start. I can't see these replacing my COPIC markers, but honestly, I can't see any markers replacing my COPIC markers. But in terms of like marker alternatives, I would give these a shot. But I think that's about all I have for you for this video, so if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Also, if you've tried these markers, feel free to let me know your thoughts on them. And thanks again to the nice and lovely people who sent these to me. They didn't have to, but they did. And I really enjoyed using them. I'm actually really curious on how their 120 set is like, because typically for my art style, I prefer to have more markers because I do a lot of layering and blending and all of that, which typically requires more markers. But even so, I was still able to make this 80 set work, and I'm sure many of you, this is all you will really need, so definitely give it a shot. I'll have a link in the description box where you can get these markers if you want to try them out. And if you are new here, hello, my name is Oliver. I post a new video here every single Wednesday. I make a lot of art, as you can probably tell. I make digital art, I make traditional art, I make speed paints, sketch vlogs, whatever I really feel like doing, honestly. So if any of that is of interest to you, consider subscribing. I'd love to have you here. And if you want to see more from me, you can follow me on social media. Those will be shown on screen now and linked in the description box below. And if you want to see some more videos of mine, there will be some on screen now and linked in the iCard for you to check out. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye.